Good afternoon, class. Welcome back. I'm going to continue with some focus on the material we were discussing this morning, which is the emergence of cities and also, to some degree, suburbs, and what they have to say about the relationship between humans and their natural environment, and specifically what they have to say about the relationship between Americans and their natural environment from essentially the 19th century on into the 20th century. And I was talking, I'm just going to quickly show you these so people can look back on these if they need a little more time. But we're talking about cities, but on some level we're also discussing suburbs. And the word suburb is a little bit of a unique one. It essentially means suburban, meaning the area or land surrounding a city which is subject or sort of serves the needs of the city as a whole. So a suburb or suburban implies that relationship. Of course, by the mid-20th century, you might start to question who's in charge of who, because suburbs become such a sweeping phenomenon of the settlement patterns within mid-20th century America that you could probably argue that the cities were subject to the suburbs in some respects. But we're going to be paying attention to this issue and what it says about the relationship. These are a couple thought questions that we entertained in class. And then we proceeded to talk a little bit about cities, sort of some of the earliest theories surrounding their emergence. But one of the things I just want to revisit before we, as a form of review, we were talking about von Thunen. And von Thunen is, again, an economist slash sociologist who's talking about the phenomenon of the predictability of city patterns, of the establishment patterns of cities. And what I want you to think about when we see this model of von Thunen's rings, we should be thinking about how a city, kind of like as we were talking in our early discussion today, about how a city has many of the same shared needs as, say, a human body. It suggests that a city needs to have arranged around it an environment or a habitat that allows the city to meet all or most of its needs. And so, in some ways, we can think of this as an organic city. An organic city meaning simply a city that behaves something like an organism in that it derives its needs from its surroundings. And that's an important distinction to understand. Cities throughout most of human history have followed this sort of organic model. They have needed to be essentially self-sufficient. Now, of course, individuals within those cities are not self-sufficient because they need to rely upon one another and the specialization and the surplus that comes from some individuals creating more than they need, producing more than they need, and then trading and thereby sharing with those others in their midst to create a community and a set of interconnections and dependencies that various members of a city will use to rely upon one another. It's also worth noting, as you think about what I'm saying, you probably can think of countless ways in which our current settlement in, say, the city of Walla Walla doesn't necessarily follow that. For example, most of you, the clothing that you're wearing does not come from the Walla Walla Valley. A lot of the foods that you eat come from beyond our valley. So in many respects, we have sort of gone beyond this organic model of the city, but more on that later. Okay, talked a little bit about the processes and the rates at which American society throughout the 19th century became increasingly urban. That census of 1920 is particularly noteworthy, where we see the United States population officially tip beyond we officially become urban in the sense that a majority of us find ourselves living in at least middle-sized cities and areas that we will call urban in their character. So there you have that. Pardon me. Okay, so causes of urbanization. For most of you, this isn't new. It's kind of if you've taken American history, you've probably talked a little bit about the progressive era and the late 1800s and the industrialization of America and how this drove various forces within American society. But essentially, the late 1800s are very significant in the United States for their embracing of an industrial economy. And this industrial economy does a lot of things. It helps explain the United States' emergence as a world power with a very strong economy. It also is an example, as Rutkow discusses in our assigned reading that we have that we're reading throughout in the background of the course. We talk about things like trees and how they fueled things like the railroad economy and the many sub-industries attached to it, and the timber economy, which is going to be central to the expansion and development of America's built environment. So industrialization is very important, and that's fueled, the population changes are fueled in part by immigration, and you'll see that during the late 1800s, a lot of immigrants to the United States are coming from places in southern and eastern Europe. It's sort of like the second great wave of American immigration, and it tends to feature the southern and eastern parts of Europe. And this was actually a challenging time for the United States. The United States has a long, storied, and complicated relationship over issues of immigration. And it oftentimes seems like there is a general reluctance to admit new immigrants. But it's always, of course, the irony is that it's oftentimes former immigrants that are trying to have the line drawn after them, such that no new immigrants will come in after their generation of immigrants have arrived. And so we even see this very much into the present. But you'll see here there's also a second movement, and that is immigration of people from rural America into urban America. And these people, of course, both the external and internal immigrants to American cities, are the lifeblood that provides the labor pool that is oftentimes necessary to drive an industrial revolution. So these people who are coming and relocating, in many cases they're undergoing tremendous hardship. Any industrial revolution is rarely a pretty thing to watch. It usually starts with people having very substantial demands made of them, their time. They're oftentimes not paid very well. The circumstances under which they live and the circumstances under which they work are oftentimes awful. But it also tends to be temporary. It tends to be a period of time through which a economy will work its way through to a better standard of living and therefore a better quality of life. It doesn't always happen that way, but generally speaking, in the United States, it certainly did. And here you'll see the rural to urban migration and the declining rural character of American society. Now, as I prepare to wrap this up, I just want to point out that the industrial era in the United States also brings with it a fairly dramatic change in terms of the character of cities that emerge. And this is a somewhat modern phenomenon. We talked about the organic city. Well, with the onset of industrialization, both in Europe and especially in the United States, we're going to see this new phenomenon known as machine cities. And what this means is that cities start to form for the purposes of industrial productivity. So unlike a typical city that evolves over the course of centuries or even thousands of years, where the people are essentially coming together and then creating a specialized community of settlement where there is reliance upon one another and there is a need to have most all of the needs of the residents of that city met within a fairly short distance of the city itself. Now we start to see with these machine cities a different phenomenon, and it's partly a phenomenon of industrialization. It's also partly a phenomenon of globalization, and it helps explain a little bit more of the character of city life that most of us live in today. So we think of capitalism when we know that natural resources are essential, that in order to feed the machines of industrialization, one needs to have natural resources. Sometimes these natural resources will come from fairly far away. For example, the case of iron ore, some of the industrial ore, some of it comes from places like northern Minnesota and the Mesabi Iron Range, but at other parts it's going to come all the way from Argentina or Chile, and that's going to be the raw material upon which the iron and steel economy of the United States is going to be formed. Likewise, oil. Sometimes the oil that is necessary to fuel the Industrial Revolution, particularly the Second Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s, that's going to come from, in some cases, faraway places. So what we start to see is less cities that are drawing upon their surrounding areas, sort of in that neat little model of von Thunen's rings. Pardon me, but now we're going to start to see cities that draw upon essentially the world around them and the supply chains of raw materials to drive industrialization, also the destinations to which goods will be sent. Markets will be established at various places throughout the world. So we start to see the city itself becomes less like an organism and more like a machine, where you take inputs from far away, feed them into the machine creates these outputs, and some of these outputs then get shipped to other places. It's not an organism, it's not an organic arrangement, it's more like a engineered and highly regulated, but also not so concentrated of a process. It's more like, I guess it's for me, I think of it as the difference. It's the difference between natural conception of a child or a test tube baby, where you're allowing the process to happen somewhat naturally and locally, or you're engineering and taking calculated and specific action to make it happen. So this is marks a very different change. And of course, many of the cities that we look at today, our Pittsburghs and our Denvers and our Chicagos and so on and so forth. Some of these big cities, most all the big cities, in fact, in the United States are going to be formed like this. Our Cleveland, Ohio's, and so on and so forth. So you see some of these natural resources that are coming and playing a critical role in the development of this area. These cities tend to occur, these new machine cities tend to occur at transport points, so transportation is pretty key, but it's no surprise that a lot of these cities form along rivers, where the transportation of goods both into the city and the resources into the city and the produced goods are shipped out for markets beyond the city. These sorts of things are happening. And then also each city in this far-flung, in the case of the United States, this far-flung nation tends to specialize in things. So we see, like in the Pennsylvania steel towns, of course, an emphasis upon steel. Cincinnati, a meat packing area, emphasis upon pork. Chicago, similar in the sense that it's a meat packing area for the most part. These different cities take on their own niche, so they become more specialized, sort of like a machine. Cities are now it's not so important that they have a balanced sort of self-sufficiency where they can take care of their own needs. Now the cities themselves are helping to take care of one another's needs. And this is very different, because what we're now going to have, and you'll see it as we talk about Upton Sinclair's reading from The Jungle. It's one of our assigned documents this week. Some really disturbing problems that come with the concentrations. When an area becomes committed almost exclusively to 1, 2, or 3 narrow purposes, it has some consequences for the way in which the people who inhabit that city or that area go about things. With that, I will stop. Thanks.